In this video, we are going to talk about human nature and how it's presented and how it's explored in Of Mice and Men. So this might come up as a question on a future exam. And don't think I'm talking here about the Edexcel IGCSE English Literature exams. At the time of recording, I don't believe this has ever come up. But it's a really important theme, and it very well could come up. If it doesn't come up, some of the points here are still useful for other questions, other themes, or even character-based questions. So here's what I would argue are kind of the main points I would explore about this novella and its connection with the theme of human nature. The first thing I would argue is that human nature is presented by Steinbeck as self-destructive, and I would start with thinking about the setting of Salinas River and how idyllic it is presented. So we've got water is warm, we've got yellow sands, sunlight, golden foothill slopes, we've got these willows that are fresh and green. So we've got this imagery of warmth and the lusciousness of the greenery that help create an idyllic backdrop, which I think helps accentuate the flaws of humankind. So everything seems so perfect in the background that it just comes to forefront just how imperfect all these characters are who represent, of course, humankind. In that scene, when we are reading that beautiful description of the Salinas River, we already have indications of how destructive mankind can be. We've got the path has been beaten hard, we've got ashes from the many fires. So the presence of man intrudes upon that tranquility and the perfection of that scene, and draws a parallel to the shouts of men that intrudes upon Lenny and George recalling their dream at the end of the novella as well. So it always seems to be that men are kind of ruining things. So you might argue that it doesn't only symbolise the destructive nature of man, but it also suggests that we pay the ultimate price for our own destruction, that we are almost like victims of ourselves, because we've got this beautiful, perfect scene of the Salinas River and mankind has ruined it. And just think about maybe like we've been given this beautiful life, we've been given these wonderful opportunities, and we just seem to ruin life. That's kind of a very cynical reading of Mice and Men, but maybe that's what Steinbeck was trying to say. Linked to that is the cyclical structure. It begins at Salinas River and it ends at Salinas River. So this, you might argue, symbolises the inescapable flaws of humankind. Now think about the fact that this novella was written in 1937. What do we see internationally at that point is the rise of Hitler and an anticipated Second World War. So could this have inspired Steinbeck to question whether humankind ever learned from their mistakes, or do we just seem to go round in circles? So everything in blue is context. So if you are doing the Edexcel IGCSE exam, you do need to link everything to context. It's worth half the mark, so it's really important, hence why I've highlighted it. So how can we link this to context? Now, we've talked a little bit about context already in terms of the rise of Hitler, but what else? So we've got the title's allusion to Robert Burns' famous quote, "The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry." So the whole point of that is basically saying that man is doomed. Okay, we can plan our lives as much as we want, but often things don't go to plan. Not only are poverty and exploitation obstacles in man's life, but so is human nature. That's what I think Steinbeck is trying to argue. So by creating that contrast between the idyllic Salinas River and the destructive nature of humankind, what Steinbeck is really doing is highlighting the deeply entrenched flaws of humankind that we cannot escape. And again, that links to the cyclical structure. And if you want to talk specifically about why he thinks that, well, he witnessed the 1930s, and here he saw the Great Depression, he saw the Dust Bowl, and he saw basically what he might argue mankind kind of ruining things for themselves and each other. Kind of linked to that is this idea that human nature is cruel. There are so many different examples of this. I've just selected ones that are easy to remember. So of course we have crooks referred to by the N-word a number of times. We have Curly's wife being called a tart. We have Lenny being called a dum-dum. There are countless examples. These are just quick ones that I could think of very quickly, where in an exam I wouldn't have to look them up in the book. So kind of saving exam time here. But it just gives good examples of how the weakest members of the ranch are cruelly treated. And if you can think of any other ones that you'd prefer to use, then that's fine. I would also draw attention to Carlson in particular, because I think Carlson is a particularly cruel character, very callous. And I think specifically about when George has killed Lenny and he seems very sad, so does Slim. And Carlson doesn't understand why they're sad. And he says, now what the hell you suppose is eating them two guys? Like, he can't even comprehend why they might feel sad over the death of Lenny. So we also saw this in the fact that he couldn't appreciate the emotional connection between Candy and his dog. So that was already concerning. That's one thing. But to be unable to comprehend the sadness of George and Slim over the death of Lenny is actually quite terrifying. And it reveals that he has a complete emotional detachment to others and a complete disregard for human life as well. We also have the heron and the water snake. So towards the end of the novella, when we've got Lenny returning to the Salinas River, there is a description of the heron eating the water snake, and then very quickly another water snake replaces that one. So you might argue that that kind of predatory behaviour draws parallels with the cruelty on the ranch. And so what we're about to see in that setting is Lenny being hunted by Curly and other men. So that's kind of the parallel that's being drawn between the natural world and human life. And so you might argue that through that parallel, Steinbeck is arguing that humans are innately cruel. It's within our nature. We're part of the natural world, and that's the way we are kind of programmed to behave. Also thinking about the barn, this is where Lenny kills the puppy and then Curly's wife, and the barn is described as the air is dusky even though it's very light outside. And so you might argue that this is supposed to kind of represent human nature as well. The increasing darkness of that barn creates a sinister setting. And could you argue that it represents man's fundamental nature, their innate violence? What we see Lenny do and the way he behaves when he kills Curly's wife, is that a human in its purest form? So one must consider whether Steinbeck is suggesting that it is in our very nature to be cruel, or if it is the world in which we live that has bred this savagery. So, this is only one reading saying that he's trying to argue that humans are cruel. Maybe he's arguing it's the world we live in that has made us cruel. So remember to explore interpretations in your answer to get those high marks. So in such desperate times of the 1930s, you might argue people could only afford to focus on one thing, and that was to survive. Is it the world in which the characters live that has made them so cruel, or is it their very nature? You might link to the rising popularity of social Darwinism during the 1930s, or 1920s, 1930s. And this belief is basically that the strongest in society survive and the weakest die out. And so that belief left no room for compassion for the weakest, like Lenny, like Candy, like the sheepdog, and so on. There's a belief, there's a natural order of things. Those people aren't supposed to survive. Those people aren't supposed to excel in life. It's quite callous, it's quite harsh. And Steinbeck is really kind of drawing our attention to the way humans interacted with one another, especially in the 1930s. He also argues that they are social beings, that they need that connection with one another. And he does that by really showing how lonely they all are, but almost highlighting the loneliness of the other characters is to provide that friendship of George and Lenny as a contrast. And who notices Slim? He says, ain't many guys that travel around together. Maybe everybody in the whole damn world is scared of each other. So George and Lenny's friendship does provide that contrast. And so you might argue through that friendship, Steinbeck was advocating for an alternative way to be. Why is it that everyone in this world is scared of each other? Why is everyone in competition with each other? Look at George and Lenny. It is possible to create meaningful connections. However, I would draw your attention to the fact that George is repeatedly referred to playing solitaire in this novella. And that, you might argue, foreshadows what awaits him, that he is going to have a lifetime of loneliness because he's going to have to kill Lenny. Or could it actually indicate that deep down he really is lonely? Because although he has a friend in Lenny, Lenny doesn't have the emotional capacity, he doesn't have the mental maturity to be a true companion to George. And so is it really enough to have a friend like Lenny? Okay, so you might argue actually just indicates that he is deeply lonely. We also see loneliness exemplified in Curly's wife. She's always saying she's looking for Curly, one that indicates that her husband is neglectful and is never around her, but it also shows that she's yearning for human interaction. She's not really looking for Curly, she's looking for conversation, and this is just a one-in for her to be able to have some sort of interaction with someone on the ranch. And Crux openly talks about being lonely. Eventually he opens up and says a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick, and so he really outlines the detrimental impact of being lonely. Linking this to context, you'll want to talk about the many reasons why people felt isolated in the 1930s. Steinbeck is basically saying this was a really lonely time for people. One reason is the migratory nature of work due to the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, and that kept men on the move. They couldn't form those meaningful relationships and friendships because they were never in one place for too long. Due to high unemployment, women weren't welcome in the workplace, so they were kind of living on the outskirts of society as well, or of public life. The Jim Crow laws legalised segregation between whites and blacks. That's why Crux is so lonely. And just in general, this is at least from Steinbeck's perspective, he saw capitalism as a system that caused rifts between fellow human beings and created this competitiveness between them, which obviously is not a breeding ground for friendships and relationships. And so he might have been using this novella to highlight kind of the downside of having a capitalist economy. But despite all of those negative things that we have covered so far, he does, I think, at least Steinbeck is trying to say human nature is complex. It's not all of one thing. It's not all evil. It is not all doomed. It is capable of good. And I've chosen two characters that I think represent this the most, George and Slim. I think both of them are moral compasses in this novella. So George, thinking about the way that he is always looking out for Lenny. He also talks about a time when he wasn't so kind to Lenny. He was actually really quite cruel to him, and he talks him into jumping into, I think it was a lake or a river, I can't remember exactly the anecdote, and Lenny almost drowned, and he says, "I ain't done nothing like that no more." So in that moment, that was a turning point for George, and he realises the moral duty that comes with power. The power that he has is the power over Lenny. And he realised from that moment not to exploit that power, but actually what that brings is great responsibility. And we see that with George. He feels very responsible for Lenny. That draws a real contrast between the likes of George, who uses his power responsibly, and the likes of the boss, who uses his power to exploit the workers and treat them terribly. Or Curly's a great one as well. Also Slim, we are immediately introduced to Slim through the eyes of Candy, really, who describes him as a hell of a nice fella. So he's immediately established as this moral authority. We know that he's known as kind of godlike, ageless. So we kind of turn to him, and so does everyone else on the ranch, to make the right decisions. And he really displays qualities of kindness and compassion. He's very friendly with everyone, and he seems to be very fair. So we see goodness in human nature through these two characters in particular. So you might argue that they are symbols of human compassion, and that creates a striking contrast with the society in which they live. This is a time of high unemployment caused by the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, and they live in a world where it's every man for themselves. Added on to that, think about kind of the political world or the political backdrop at this moment. So we've got President Hoover, who championed the notion of rugged individualism and self-reliance. He argued that basically enabling people to look after themselves, not getting too involved and giving too many benefits and social welfare to others and helping them, he argued actually protected American liberties. But what others might argue, such as Steinbeck, was that actually abandoned our moral duty to protect the most vulnerable in society. So through the characters of Slim and George, Steinbeck could have been arguing that the current political mindset went against the human need for compassion. So again, remember to try and think about an overall message, and this is up for interpretation. So do you think Steinbeck was trying to say that humans are completely doomed? Was he trying to say that they're innately cruel? Or was he trying to say that they were the product of a cruel world? Was he trying to argue that they need emotional connections to survive? Or ultimately, was he trying to say that actually we are capable of good and overcoming all these terrible things that kind of go against us? So think about that. Always think about the overall message. Steinbeck didn't think that humanity was simple. He enjoyed the complexities of human nature. So one thing I would argue is he was probably trying to argue all four things, that we are contradictory in that sense. But feel free, please, to share your own ideas in the comment section.